Good evening and welcome to this evening's City University NatCen Social Research and European Social Survey Method Seminar. I'm delighted this evening that we've got Emily Geisen from Qualtrics, who will be discussing the relationship between the design and usability of online surveys. Emily is a senior experience management scientist at Qualtrics, and she manages a team of 10 project managers in Qualtrics sample science and delivery unit. She specialises in improving data quality and reducing respondent burden in web surveys, and particularly in focusing on best practices in questionnaire design, visual design, and user experience. So we're very happy to have Emily with us this evening. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll deal with those at the end. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you very much. Give me just a second to get set up here. Okay, great. So my name is Emily Geisen, and I consider myself to be both a survey methodologist and an experience management scientist. And if you're not familiar with that term, experience management, it's really the process of measuring and improving the experiences that companies provide to customers, as well as to stakeholders.
Sorry to interrupt you. We can also see your notes. You might just want to change the view.
Oh, thank you.
No problems.
Let me fix that. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So I do know who I am without notes, but it's helpful to make sure I get everything in there that I want to say. So in this case, this combination of survey methodology and experience management helps me to improve the experience of survey taking. And so in this presentation, I'm going to share with you a few tips for improving the visual design of surveys to increase usability. But first, I want to start by sharing with you a way of thinking about design and usability. So I'm going to walk you through the relationship between design and usability. So let's be clear. Some things are just designed poorly, right? You don't need to do any usability testing to know that this is a really horrible design for an ATM. And we sometimes see the same things with surveys. You can just look at this and tell that it's a really poor design. Having to go through 9 drop downs to enter a phone number is extremely tedious and not user-friendly at all. And then other times, the design seems fine at first. You know, some writing on a pencil, very common. But it's not until people start to use it that you realize how wrong the design is. Cool to do drugs, drugs. So sometimes there's this concept that might have worked well in one context, say a t-shirt, and it simply doesn't work well in another context, like a pencil. And we encounter this with surveys too. So in this example, the researchers designed a survey that allowed for swiping from side to side to navigate through the survey. And that swiping behavior is really common in a lot of other applications, especially on smartphones. And it worked fine when people used the white space underneath the question to swipe. But when there were long questions that took up the whole screen, there was no white space. And so people would swipe over the question text. And what happened was that they inadvertently changed their answers. And what's worse is they often didn't even realize that when they went to swipe, they changed their answer from what they had originally selected to something else before moving on. I see that someone has raised their hand. Maybe that was an accident. I don't have, it's hard for me to see the chat while we're going.
I think we can ignore that for now. We'll come back to the questions at the end. Yeah.
Sure. All right, sounds good. All right, and then the third thing is that sometimes people don't use things in the way that we design them. And I think this is really the most common thing that I see when it comes to kind of the difference between design and usability. And this often occurs because the user's goals are different than the designer's goals. right? With this example, we have a designer who, they had this great image of what a beautiful park was going to look like and where they were going to put the walkways. But people in a hurry are just going to take the most direct path that they have. So that's where we have this mismatch between the user's goals and the designer's goals, and that can lead to poor user experience. And so we see this with surveys as well. And if you take a look at this slider, what you'll realize is that the respondents had to move the cursor to the middle of the box for it to register. And if we look at the top one, you can see that the cursor is right in the middle of the for box. But if you look at the bottom line, the cursor is all the way to the left of the never. And that's actually the starting point. And what the researchers observed during usability testing is that when people wanted to answer never, they didn't move that cursor to the middle. They just left it where it was because that's the easiest, most efficient thing for them to do. And if they hadn't realized this during usability testing, it would have been very problematic once they collected their survey data because they wouldn't have been able to differentiate between people who answered never and people who skipped the question altogether. So we have to keep in mind when we're designing surveys that respondents are generally going to take the shortest path possible to complete the survey. And so we need to design for that. And I just want to note that while I'm not a fan of sliders generally, with Qualtrics and a lot of other platforms, the cursor is grayed out, which at least gives a nice visual indicator that the cursor hasn't been registered and it isn't kind of highlighted until it's moved and then activated. So what you'll notice is with all of these is that the poor design was pretty easy to spot, right? When something doesn't work well, it's very obvious. But good design is actually a lot harder to see. And basically, we want our respondents not to notice our surveys, or at least not to notice the design. They shouldn't have to think about how to complete our surveys. They just do them and then move on. So how do we create this invisible design? Well, one of the things is that to have a design that's invisible, we as researchers, as designers, have to actually see our respondents. So not a single one of these people is saying, oh my God, I love surveys. I'll do any survey you want, no matter how long. What you see is that people will do it if it's short and easy enough, or they recognize that it's important, but they're really busy too. So it's not the most important thing to them. Or maybe they're just doing it because you offer an incentive. We also have to realize that people are tired, they're exhausted, or maybe they're only doing this, while waiting in line at the DMV. That even though our research is a priority to us, it might not be a priority to our survey respondents, and that really they're doing us a favor when they take a survey. So we have to keep that in mind when designing surveys, and this leads me to my recommendations. I think one of the most important things to know when designing a survey is that people don't read. They scan. I know I don't read, I scan. If you think about emails that you've gotten, most of the time you're probably not reading all of them. You're scanning through it, because you're busy, you've got lots of things to do. And it's the same when people are reading surveys or responding to surveys. And there was a website usability study done by the Nielsen Norman Group. And they found that 79% of users scanned web pages and only 16% read every word. Now, I know that surveys are not websites, but there is some evidence that users treat text-heavy surveys in the same way. So this is a study, a usability study with eye tracking done by Jarrett and Romano. And so you can see it's a diary survey, and at the top is all the instructions, and at the bottom is where people are supposed to enter their information. And what you're seeing is a gaze plot. And so the numbers represent kind of where a given individual looked throughout the survey, and how big the number is indicates kind of how long they looked in that one spot. And so what we can see is that text scanning, they didn't read every single word. And what they did was text scanning. And we can see that this text scanning follows kind of an F-shaped pattern where people read all along the top line and then they kind of scroll down the side. They might read a little bit further of one line, scroll down the side again. And then we also see that people were very much drawn to the answer boxes. So having conducted a lot of cognitive and usability tests, I've noticed the same thing. Respondents are often drawn to kind of the answer information first. They want to be able to answer the survey without having to read the instructions. And so they only go back to the instructions if they need to. I like to think of this as the IKEA effect, right? If you get some furniture from IKEA and you have to put it together, there are certain people who will read all the instructions from start to finish. But most people just get right in there and they start putting the furniture together because you know what a table looks like. You have an idea of how it works. And then only when you're stuck do you go back and look at the instructions. The problem with that is that sometimes people don't realize they're stuck until they're too far along to go back and change things. So we need to keep this in mind as we're designing surveys. And so I think a lot of times when we design surveys, we envision that they're being completed by the ideal respondent. And so let me show you what I mean by the ideal respondent. And this ideal respondent is going to be played by me in this video.
Next. If you don't know the answer to a question or don't want to answer a question, click the next button without answering. The don't know and rather not say options will appear on the bottom of the screen. Try this with the question below. Do you think it will rain next Friday? Click the next button without answering the question, then click on either don't know or rather not say, then click the next button to continue. Okay. Practice question number 6. Do you think it will rain next Friday? Well, I don't know. So I click the next button without answering and then click don't know or refuse. Okay. Then I click don't know and next. Okay, if you want to see your answer to a previous question, you can click the back button. Each time you click the back button, the computer will go back one question. Try clicking the back button now. When you're finished, click the next button to continue. Okay, back. And now I click the next button and I'm back here. Okay.
Okay, so I call this the ideal respondent. And that's because this person is motivated. They're reading every word. They're following instructions. But let's contrast this with how a real respondent interacts with the surveys, with surveys. And just to be transparent, this is my husband, but I asked him to take a survey for a course I was doing, but I didn't tell him, I didn't explain why. So this is really how he answered the survey.
Do you think it will rain next Friday? Sure. Blah, blah, blah.
So I'm going to say that this is the respondent that I think you should be designing for. Now, some of you might consider him to be a bad respondent, but I don't think so. And not just because he's my husband. He's not a bot. He's not falsifying. He didn't skip a question. He didn't even answer don't know when we told him to. If we asked him reasonable things, he would give us reasonable answers. So this is the respondent I want to design for, because if we design for the ideal respondent, we're going to be disappointed when they don't answer our survey the way we designed it. So what can we do? How do we improve usability? How do we design for the people who are actually completing our surveys? So I think the first thing that we can do is choose our words carefully. Now notice I didn't say make the question as short as possible. But that is important. We do want to use as few words as possible while still clearly conveying what we need to convey. So we just need to say what we want in as few words as possible. So let me give you an example here. This question says, are you now married, widowed, divorced, separated, or never been married? And then the response options are married, widowed, divorced, separated, never been married. So this question, it'd be fine for an interviewer administered survey, but it's not great for a web survey because it has so much repeated text and it's training the respondents to skim because of that. They can kind of see that are you now married part and already figure out that they know how to answer and skip down to the response options. So what could we do about this? Instead, I think we could revise the question so that it doesn't read like a yes/no question. And we could reduce the words so that where there's no overlap, no repeat. And that way we're training respondents that everything we say is important and should be read and that they shouldn't be skipping information. Plus it's really short here. So even if someone's just scanning, it's really quick and easy for them to kind of see this and get the gist of the question and the answers. So this question, this example, you'll notice that it has 3 lines of text. But if you look closely, the last 2 lines are instructions. And so knowing that people skim, it's going to be really hard for them to kind of find that question quickly and know what they need to be answering. So instead, what I recommend is keeping the instructions as succinct as possible. So the instructions on this page said, please select all that apply, or please select none of the above if none of these conditions are applicable. So I just reduced that to select all that apply because that's really all they need to know. And then I also cut that part about none of the above because I want respondents to read through all of the options before they get to that none of the above. I don't want to suggest that they should skip the options and go straight to none of the above without seeing at least what the conditions are first. So another thing that we can do is to use visual cues instead of words to convey meanings. And with that last example, I actually did this in 2 ways. So the first one was that I put the instructions in italics. You'll notice that select all that apply. And I did that because research suggests that people are less likely to read text in italics. So I'm using this fact to make sure that the information that I want them to read, the question text, is kind of what stands out. And if anything's going to be skipped over, is this select all that apply. And so that's useful to do for instructions like this that are likely repeated on lots of questions. You wouldn't want to do this on definitions or something that people really need to read in order to understand and answer the question. But I did one more kind of visual cue as well. And that is the use of checkboxes. So the previous example, it didn't have any checkboxes or radio buttons. It was just the response option button. But I like to use these checkboxes and radio buttons because they're just a quick visual indicator of how to answer the question. So most people who are web savvy, they understand that the boxes mean check all that apply and the radio buttons mean select one. And so this visual cue reinforces that select all instructions. And I know that there are people who don't like the radio buttons checkboxes because they think it looks cluttered and that it's not as modern looking. And they're probably right. Aesthetics are important. But remember this picture. So you have to ask yourself, is your design going to stay beautiful when real people use it? Or are they just going to trample all over your grassy areas, right? So I think sometimes efficiency trumps beauty, and that we want to make sure we're designing things that are as aesthetic as possible, but also still usable. So let's think about a little bit more about how we could use visual cues. So this is a question that was used on a web screener that I worked on a few years ago before coming to Qualtrics. And I was asked to conduct some usability testing to see how people completed the survey. So you'll notice that the text is pretty long. So it wasn't surprising that we observed that some people did not completely read the question. What they did was they scanned it and they saw that phrase, including yourself, and then they saw their address, and then they looked at the entry box and they started typing. And so when they started typing, they typed in the names of the people who lived in the house. But if you actually take a second to read it, it asks how many people lived at this address. And so the way that the survey was programmed is that it would only accept numbers. So if they started trying to type in someone's name, it wouldn't allow it. So it did alert them to the error. And they were able to go back to the question and read it and realize that it was asking for the number of the people in the household. But I think that it's always better to prevent errors errors rather than correct them. And it's clear to me that people were reacting to the size of the text box. That box is, is so big that it's suggesting more information is needed than just a 1 or 2 digit number. It's kind of inviting them to write a name. So what I did was we revised this survey and we reduced the size of the text box to make it more obvious that a number should be entered here instead of names. And then we also added this, this text description, number of people. And again, that just makes it a little bit more obvious. So shortening the text probably would have helped, but our client didn't want to do that in this study. So we were able to use just visual cues to improve the usability of this question. And I just want to take a second to note here that if you're a Qualtrics user and you don't know how to do this in Qualtrics, no worries. After this session is over, we're going to be emailing registered attendees my Qualtrics tips and tricks that will show you how to do a number of these visual design improvements. Many of them use JavaScript, but I have kind of a little cheat sheet for you that should make it easier for you to do that. And so if you're doing this survey if a respondent is completing this survey on a mobile device, there's one more visual cue that could make it more obvious that a number is needed. So when we look at the first screenshot, the kind of default screenshot, the letter keyboard comes up. But we can change that input type so that it's a number keyboard that comes up. So if the image on the right, if that keyboard came up when a respondent's doing the survey, that's just one more indicator that you need to use a number instead of words. And even if the respondent already knew, if they could tell by the other visual cues that we did that a number is needed, it also just makes it easier. They don't have to worry about the long press of the W button to get the 2. They can just simply make a 2, and that makes it more efficient for users, easier, quicker for them to provide their accurate answers. And we can do a little bit more with this too. You can put information before the text box, you can put information after the text box. And again, these are just visual indicators of how you want your answer provided. Because if you ask people, how much did you spend? People don't know if they're supposed to put the $sign or not. And either you allow it, and then there's a lot of editing you have to do in the back end to strip out those $signs, or you don't permit it, and then people get errors and they have to fix it. So when you have these visual cues, it kind of lets people know just quickly, right away, with a glance, how they're supposed to answer the question, and helps you to get accurate data back. So another strategy that we can take to simplify the task for the respondent, another strategy that we can take is to simplify the task for the respondent. So let me give you an example. So let's say that I showed you this diagram and I told you to build a rocket. And I observe you, and then I am shocked to find out that you cannot build this rocket. So what should I do to make this easier for you? Obviously, I should add more instructions, right? Okay, so I've added more instructions. Surely you can build a rocket now, right? Of course not, because if the task is too complex, simply adding instructions is not going to help. Instead, what we need to do is simplify the task. What if I asked you to build this rocket? That seems a little bit more doable. So let's take a look at this question. Just at first glance, it's overwhelming. There's so much going on. It's not clear where to start, what to do. So the solution is to add more instructions, right? That'll surely help people figure out how to answer this question. No, the solution is to simplify the task. And we do that by asking one question at a time. So to simplify it, I split it into more questions. So this first question is just about whether they have used these services in the past 6 months. Simple yes or no for each of them, pretty quick and straightforward to answer. And then if they answer yes to any of them, we ask them the follow-up questions. Now this will result in more questions on your survey, but I want to note that burden isn't determined just by the number of questions, but also by the complexity of the questions. So a 10-question survey with simple, straightforward questions is going to be a lot easier for people to answer than a 5-question survey that is complex or confusing. And it might even take less time for them to answer. So the next thing that we can do is to design for all devices. And I think this is something people know pretty well now, is that many respondents are completing surveys on mobile devices now. I think when I last looked at some of our statistics at Qualtrics, it was close to 2/3 of respondents were completing surveys on mobile devices. But the problem is that even though we know that people are using mobile devices, I think a lot of times we still design for this person, right? This person with the 2 giant screens, someone who is in a private office without coworkers, without children underfoot. They're happy, they're motivated. When really, I think in reality, this is closer to the actual survey taking experience for a lot of people, especially during COVID. And so you can see he's on the phone right there, right? He's taking a survey. And yes, this is also actual footage of my family during COVID. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go into specific mobile design considerations. My main point is that you just shouldn't forget about mobile. And it shouldn't be even an afterthought. You need to be thinking about mobile from the beginning, and whether the survey types that you're asking about are appropriate for mobile, and how to adapt them and accommodate the questions for mobile respondents. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is how culture and language affect usability. Most of the advice I've given today has been based on research with US populations. And I know that many of you don't live in the US. But fortunately, a lot of the usability research suggests that many of the fundamental usability principles do hold true across countries. But I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that an instrument designed for one country or language is automatically usable in another. For example, in the US and Europe, we read from left to right. And so when people scan text, we see that F-shaped pattern that I showed you earlier. But in countries that use Arabic, they read from right to left. And so the scanning properties are consistent. It just shows a mirror image of that F-shaped pattern. And so in countries that use Arabic, we have to accommodate the surveys to account for the way that they read. And so in this example I have here, the survey has done that, but there are cultural differences that still need to be taken into account. And this specific finding is from a paper survey, not from a web survey, but I think it's really relevant in showing how cultural differences affect visual design. So the original form was designed in English, as you see here, but they needed an Arabic version too. So they knew about the right to left reading, and so they kind of switched it up and designed it for Arabic. But even though they did that, it still wasn't usable in Arabic. And the reason for that is because the individual boxes for letters, they worked in languages with print letters, but they didn't work in Arabic that uses script. So they had to revise it again to have kind of one big box to allow for the way that people write using script in Arabic. So again, it's where we realize that some of the principles hold, but it doesn't just automatically translate from one culture to another. And we also have to keep in mind that people in different cultures use things in different ways. So I don't consider myself to be a cross-cultural usability expert, but I have done a little bit of work in this area. And I do know that people in different countries use things in different ways. And so one example I have is that when I was a graduate student, I did an internship in Germany. And during that internship, we were exploring why people in the EU did not immigrate to other countries in the EU as much as was expected when the EU was formed. And so we did some in-depth interviews to guide our development of the survey questions. And there was this there's this one interview that was particularly informative. We interviewed a man who had recently immigrated from France to Germany, and we asked him about the biggest barriers from moving from France to Germany. And so naturally, he started talking about the differences in driving between the two countries. And he said that when you park on the street in France, you just back up till you hit the car behind you, and then you pull forward till you hit the car in front of you, no big deal. And then he said, if you do that in Germany, that people get mad. They act like the bumper is part of the car. So I thought that was really funny, because here's this thing, a bumper, that is used very differently in France than it is in Germany. And so we know that there are going to be differences in how people use things from one country to another. And we have to realize that certain conventions that might exist in one culture might not exist in another. And if you're not a cultural expert in the other cultures or countries that you're doing surveys in, you might not necessarily know that until you do some usability testing. So that's why I definitely recommend that you shouldn't just kind of take a design that was designed for one context and then drop it into another context without testing it to make sure that it's okay. So that's all that I have for you today. I have my email here, and again, we'll be sending my JavaScript tips and tricks to you after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was absolutely fantastic presentation. Really, really enjoyed that. And I'm sure people will be very grateful for the offer of the cheat sheet to get around some of those issues in JavaScript. If members of the audience have questions, if they could type those into the chat, then we can read those to Emily. Perhaps if we just stop sharing your screen for a moment. Sure. Just whilst we're waiting for some questions to come in, I have one for you. Have you done much sort of testing or research about vertical scrolling and sort of how comfortable respondents feel with vertical scrolling? Is that something you've looked at?
Yes, I've done a little bit with that. So I think that people are familiar with vertical scrolling, but there are a couple of concerns. And mostly it's people realize that there's no way to navigate if they don't see that next button, right? So they know they have to keep going. But what happens is that the options that people can see without scrolling, those are the ones that are going to get a little bit more attention. So there does tend to be a little bit more of a primacy effect where the options at the top are more likely to be selected, but it appears to be pretty small. There is also a slight issue with the vertical scrolling, where again, you might inadvertently change your answer when you're doing the scrolling. But it seems to be less problematic with the vertical scrolling than the horizontal scrolling, or even the horizontal navigation.
Thank you. There's some nice comments in the chat. Thank you for the presentation. People recommend it to their students, for example, from Edith Lou, which is very nice. Someone's asked whether the script will be sent via email. So yes, we can. Emily's offered to share that after, so we can send it to people who've joined this evening. There's a question here from Georgina. She says Qualtrics is fairly unique and it offers more customization in order to implement some of these tricks. The one I have used most is Smart Survey, which is good but potentially more limited in functionality. Have you ever done any comparisons between Smart Survey?
I'm not familiar with Smart Survey. So I will say it's there's always that trade-off, right, between with any product with flexibility and ease. When you have a tool that offers more functions and features, it can be a little bit more complex to use. And then things that are often easier to use, you can't do as much with them. So you have to kind of find that platform that gets you what you need and is easy enough for you to kind of figure out how to do things the way you want to do quickly and efficiently.
Thank you. There's a question from Justin. How does ADA compliance impact visual design choices? For example, we've had to stop using several cues like different font size, color, etc.
Yeah, it's so the thing with the ADI is that you want to make sure that your visual cues are more than just one thing. Like you can't use just color. So maybe it's color and size. So I am not an accessibility expert, but we do have some folks on our team at Qualtrics, and they are working on a more accessible layout that's just going to be the default layout and is very accessible. And what I'm working on is kind of helping to make sure that when they make changes to the layout to make it more accessible, that it's still meeting best practices for general visual design and usability, which is a tough challenge, right? To make a layout that's perfect for everyone. But I do recommend that, especially not just color is the biggest one for making something ADA compliant. And then there are a few other considerations for screen readers. So one in particular I know is that drag and drop questions, they are not compliant. And so they're honestly not that usable on a mobile device either. So I know at least in Qualtrics, we indicate which of our questions are currently not ADA compliant, and we usually offer an alternative version. So for example, for a ranking question, you can have it where you enter in 1, 2, 3 instead of kind of dragging and moving in order to have an accessible option.
Excellent. There's also been a clarification in the chat about what's ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Thank you for Justin for clarifying that. Question from Debbie Collins: could you describe what the usability testing process might look like for the things that you've developed?
Sure. So at the basic level, it's just watching a real user complete your survey, and then observing what they do and noting what works well, what doesn't work well, and then revising it and testing it again. So that's kind of at its simplest form. But obviously, if you can get much more in depth, you can use eye tracking and other devices. The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing a usability test is that it's qualitative. And so anytime that you have qualitative, you're going for kind of more breadth of experiences and less of the ability to say, oh, 22% of people who take our survey is going to have this problem. So I like to start with small, maybe 5 people at a time, and try and think about the major types of people who are going to have different experiences in your survey. So if you're doing a survey of your employees, your new employees might have a different experience than your employees you've had for 20 years. Or it could be people on a mobile device are going to have a different experience than people on a desktop. So you want to think about all those different experiences and make sure you're testing it with those people. And then really it's just kind of observing how they take the survey. And one thing that I really like to focus on is inevitably people will experience usability issues, or they'll have errors. And what's really important is whether someone can resolve that error on their own. So if you think about like a typical matrix question, right? And someone is answering it, a matrix or a grid question, and they skip a row and then they go and hit next. And then it's like, oh, you skipped a row. And then they can easily go back and answer that question and move on. So certainly if there was a way, changing the way it's designed, making it smaller to make it less likely that someone skipped a question, that would be great. But also, this happens often enough. People are alerted to that. It's easy for them to go back and fix it. It doesn't really ruin their experience. Where there are other types of issues that people have where they struggle a lot more. They don't know how to fix it. They don't know how to move on, or it's taking a lot of time, or they provide an inaccurate answer because of it. Those are the ones that I would really focus on when you're doing your usability testing, so that you can kind of prioritize resources to the most important problems that you're experiencing.
And do you mostly do that usability testing with the respondents of in person when you're watching, or do you do it in some kind of remote manner with like videos to watch them? And
yeah, you can do both. I mean, I think everybody now knows how to use Zoom and screen sharing. I was doing that even before the pandemic, and it's nice. It's so much easier now because now everybody has Zoom and I don't even have to send people the tutorials. So I think the one thing where where you get a little bit more value with the in-person is on a mobile device, because when you're doing the screen sharing, you can't see where people are touching. So you can't tell if someone's like tapping something thinking it's a link, but it's not. There is a workaround for that, and that's to ask people to enable touches on their mobile device, but it's a setting that they have to change. Like, so you have to instruct them how to go into their settings and set it up so that when it touches, it makes like a little tap so that when you're doing screen sharing, you can see it. So that's what I try to do when I have people testing with mobile. But I also recognize some people, you try to show them how to do that and they can't. You have to look up the instructions for 22 different types of phones, and it can be hard. So I'd say that's the biggest limitation with doing it virtually. But if you do it in person, then on the other hand, you have to have like a fancy device to kind of videotape the mobile device, like a document camera, or there's a device called a Mr. Tappy, which is it's like a little platform, and you put your phone on it. It's really small and handy, and it's got the video right there. So I think both are options, pretty straightforward that you can use.
Great, thank you. Question from Anne Connolly. How would you balance the need for clarity, i.e. providing definitions and instructions, whilst also minimizing the amount of text in the questions? Would you always recommend reducing the amount of text?
No, I think clarity is really important. I think there's only kind of finite amount of word. I mean, there is a finite amount of words, I think, that people are going to read. But if you have a lot of information that you need to convey to people and there's just no way to shorten it, what I'd recommend is some sort of chunking. So what I mean by that is, instead of having like a paragraph full of text, is to split it into paragraphs or use bullets, or see if you can separate it into multiple questions in order to get that information in there. Because a question that is so short that it's vague is not useful either. So it's not about the just, let's make everything as short as possible. It needs to be able to convey what you want to convey in as few words as possible. So it's really just about reducing unnecessary words or redundant words. And if you have a questionnaire that has mostly short questions and then one longer one, you've probably trained people that the words that you're using are important, and so they're more likely to read it than if you had lots of questions that were really long, wordy, and unnecessary. Then you're training people to skim and scan and not read as thoroughly.
Thank you very much. Interesting question here from Sierra. Conserving time series in questions is important for just traditional face-to-face surveys, going mixed mode or to web. Do you have an opinion on whether making your suggested changes would disrupt the time series enough to discourage making these changes? Big question.
The time series is always a battle. I mean, I think that if you're already moving from face-to-face to web, like your trend data is already going to change, because there are just so many inherent differences, and there are people who are more likely to respond to web than face-to-face, and vice versa. So at that point, you might as well make changes to make sure that the data you're getting is as good and accurate as possible. But when it comes to kind of mixed mode design, I like to do the approach where you're going for measurement equivalence. And so what that means is that, whatever that underlying concept is that you're measuring, you want that answer, that information, to be the same whether someone is doing it face-to-face or on a web. And that often means that you ask the question slightly differently. Because in the web, we can have validation checks, we can have the visual format and tell people how to answer it. And in a face-to-face, you have an interviewer who can clarify and follow up. So I find it very hard to do kind of the unimode format where it's exactly the same in multiple modes and get that same measurement equivalency. But at the same time, if you're designing something to begin with, it's a little bit easier, I think, to go for that one design that will work well in both modes, where you kind of keep as much the same as possible. But is constantly a challenge that everybody has to deal with when they're looking at their time series data and trying to maintain trends.
Thank you very much. There's quite a few people asking about the slides. So the slides will be made available afterwards with the recording, and Stefan Swift will email those round in due course. And there'll also be information there about the JavaScript that Emily kindly agreed to share. So there's a question here from Sinead. Would you recommend making questions on your online surveys mandatory to ensure people don't miss them? We often give people who don't know or prefer not to say that the questions are currently not mandatory. Sure.
Yeah, I don't recommend making them mandatory. I know that if you run a survey through Qualtrics, our project managers often recommend making the surveys, the questions required, but I don't recommend doing that. Actually, just recently did an audit of our online panel providers, and online being like the non-probability samples, and even compared to a probability sample or college students or your customer list or some more motivated list, even our online panel respondents, when we don't make the questions mandatory, I think only 2.5% of respondents skipped more than 3 questions. So really wasn't a lot of people skipping questions. And then when I looked at the people who skipped a couple of questions, compared them with other quality indicators, they were no better or worse in terms of quality. So to me, it seemed like when people are skipping questions, it's because they feel like they don't know the answer and they're not able to answer them. So what you could do is request an answer, which is more of a soft error. It might say like, hey, you missed this question. If you want to answer it, go back and answer it. If not, move on. And that way you don't have people skipping questions accidentally, but then you're still allowing people to skip a question if they really don't know it, because I think that tends to give you a little bit better data.
Thank you. There's just quite a long statement that's come in here now, so I'm not going to attempt to try to paraphrase that right now.
Sure.
What's your experience or advice on gender-related aspects?
So I looked into some of the research on this with the I prefer to self-describe option. So the question was about, what category should we use? So I recommend the male, female, and then some sort of third option such as non-binary, gender fluid. And then there is a question about whether you should have the category I prefer to self-describe and have that open-ended. The couple of times that we did that, I found that the self-described answers were not what we were looking for. They were often rude or inappropriate, or people just kind of exclaiming their cisgendered nature and why we shouldn't be asking questions like that. So I felt like it was more often misused than it was properly used. But I don't know, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still offer that and you can just filter out those response options. I just didn't find that it was used the way we thought it would be used as much. But I think this is something that is still that we can't make a final decision on at this point, and that as people get more used to seeing questions like this, we'll probably get fewer of those inappropriate answers and people will feel more comfortable using it the way that it's intended. So I don't have a good answer right now. I think that it's something that we need to keep monitoring and researching because kind of the best practice today might not be the same best practice in 6 months or a year.
As for the related issues, interesting that you mentioned the cross-cultural dimension. One of the things we found recently in the European Social Survey when we're transitioning during the pandemic to some countries to online surveys is the need to have different gendered versions, that before the interview would perhaps adapt the questionnaire to the male or female version. But for example, in Poland, then you actually need a separate version which respondents can choose. So there's lots of issues around gender that are quite complicated with online surveys. And there's some shameless plugs apparently being put into the chat. So please take a moment to have a look at those. A question from Debbie: have you had experience of offering a voice recording option as an alternative to people having to type in an answer to an open question? And also maybe a related question coming from me, that have you ever had experience of the questions being read out to respondents as well? So recording, but also delivering the question orally.
Yeah, I'll answer the recording one first. Yeah, I've done a few studies with that. I personally find it hard because then you have to transcribe all the recordings. I mean, there is software options that make it easier for you. For example, I think Qualtrics has an integration with Vox Pop Me. So not only can you get recording, you can get video if that's important to you. But something else I've been exploring, and I haven't analyzed the results yet, sorry, so I don't know if this will help, but is asking people to use their text-to-speech for the open-ended questions in order to see if that generates longer responses. So I've had a few people tell me that that's what they do, and they get much more detailed open-ended responses than if people just have to type it in, especially with mobile. So that's something that I'm exploring. And then as for having the questions read to respondents, I did some of that prior to Qualtrics. We had a number of surveys that were ACASI, audio computer assisted self-interviewing. So they were actually in-person surveys, but the interviewer would ask a few questions and they would turn the laptop over to the respondent and they would take the whole survey on their own. They're very sensitive questions about drug use and mental health. And so a lot of people completing the survey didn't have very high literacy rates. And so all of the questions were read aloud and the respondent could use the headphones. And it was text-to-speech that did that as well. I forget which version we used, I think Microsoft or some off-the-shelf version. And it worked really well. It was really nice. You would have to go in with a few of the questions and like tell it how to pronounce them. For example, we asked about a lot of prescription drug names. And so it mispronounced all of them and some of the street drugs as well. So you can go in and kind of phonetically sound out things so that it will pronounce it correctly. But it was really helpful for your time series questions, right? Where most of the survey stays the same year to year. But you might make a few wording updates and you don't want to have to record and re-record entire questions because you changed one or two little words in there. The text-to-speech can kind of do that automatically. We did find that I think most people didn't listen to the survey because it takes longer. So it was usually only the people who needed to listen to the survey who would listen to the survey.
And it was possible for respondents to choose whether that was actually included or not. Yeah.
Yeah, and we even instructed them to wear the headphones either way, and if they didn't like it, to just turn the volume down so that they wouldn't feel like if they used the headphones, it meant they were illiterate or anything. That just everyone would have the headphones.
Thank you. And time for one last question. This one from Alice McGee. Please, could you say a little bit more about the touchscreen sharing option for remote usability testing using Zoom? This sounds something we definitely like to explore.
Yeah. Hey, Alice. I can send you. I'm trying to think of what it's called, because it really is like it's different if you have an Android versus an iPhone versus a Pixel. So I think it's called Touch Settings. I'm not sure exactly, but it's definitely a setting within your phone. So what I can do is I can send that. I can try and send the instructions that I've found previously for common phone types, along with the kind of JavaScript tips and tricks. And that should be at least enough to get you started to understand what it is that what it is that I was doing. And then when you have your respondents, before the interview, you'll just have to ask them what type of phone that they use. And then you might have to kind of Google and figure out how to do it in advance and then kind of send them screenshots or walk them through it the first kind of 10 minutes of your session.
Emily, thank you for a wonderful presentation and for answering all those questions. Clearly a lot of interest in your work, and special thanks for offering these tips. I'm sure they'll be greatly appreciated. And really like to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to the audience for all their interest this evening, and look forward to seeing everyone at the next method seminar series. Good night.
Absolutely.